It is when you.
Then she didn't want the tires to go on it. So they took those tires and then she bought other tires. Just to share something. And the other tires were tall. The shifting ain't here. Thank you. Name and administration. There's no belt.
Time? Yeah. That's big.
Oh. That motor's registration is G. My driver's license is G. So you're getting selected 2 times? Yeah, yeah. Double the number. The chances of getting, yeah. I never realized that. Sure.
Other counties, they used to have it stable.
We do have some old books, I just don't know what we want.
Okay.
Come on down.
Not all.
Water bill insurance. When we go to purchase
Those ones they focus on.
Oh, I got it, yeah. So that's what.
Okay.
Who knows what we have there? Go through these doors, go straight down the hallway. How does one left? Well, you say assessor. One door's locked, there's 2 doors. There's a flat, old flash usually have a road. Parcel.
These surveys were they surveyed and it said, first flat.
Possibility.
Cuties.
We don't have.
They have checked there, they don't have.
Yeah, come see what we got. We got the old binders. Wonder if it was a natural curve or.
Their price was just a little bit less. There was within $200 of addition on the price. I knew what reach out the boat was.
Yeah.
But
you guys?
everything I had.
I'm here.
I've ever done to that paper. In a ledger. He said, you keep records, Mr. Governor. I can keep drops of fuel went in there.
Oh, sorry, Bill.
No problem. We went over all of it.
So did you give him your other vehicle down, or you still have it?
I still got it.
Yeah.
I'm gonna put something else on it, try to sell it.
Oh, yeah? So you didn't trade it in?
I'm gonna be, if I don't sell it.
Got really stuck.
I says, well, there's no use you gonna look at it.
Pretty good.
You wasting my time and you wasting yours.
Yeah.
I says, I'm not gonna give it away. He said, well, let's go.
No,
look
we
at
didn't
it.
make it that
So
far.
we went out and looked,
When you get to the court.
went over everything, and then he went in. I said, I know what
When you get through.
NADA is.
Almost
I
allowed to,
said, a little over 18. What do you want to trade? I said, I'll take 18.
we were on the Goldmark's property or.
We said we should take 17, 17.5.
Kind of like where it goes over.
I'll split the difference with you. He said 17,250.
Yeah.
I said, no, I wasn't very good at school.
Well, not quite.
You no, count money, you know, you need to go. He did
Not the one that,
I said,
when winter comes, it comes out
17,
almost, it comes out right above grades.
and with the sales
So
tax deals.
grades is
gain a lot from it.
Overlooks it, on that side.
He could sell.
Okay, 1:30,
To sell.
we have a continued public hearing, proposed WATV proposal. I'll open it up to Mr. Houston and staff.
Thank you, Commissioners. For your record, I'm Perry Huston, Director of Planning for Okanogan County. With me is Josh Thompson, County Engineer. As you've indicated, you are in a continued public hearing. Consider an ordinance that, if adopted, would open certain identified roads in District 1 and a portion of District 2 to the use by wheeled all-terrain vehicles. You continued the public hearing for purposes of giving an update on the status of the signage, which was part of one of the conditions for your mitigated determination of non-significance, which was a result of the environmental review conducted on the proposal. So with that as background, I would pass the baton to Mr. Thompson to give you an update in terms of the status of installing the signs and the types of signs they provide.
Commissioners, for the record, Josh Thompson, County Engineer. We ordered the penalty signs that, read up to $1,000 penalty for illegal off-road use. Those will be here by the end of this week. We also went through and created a map of all the points where we would use those delineators with the red X to denote a closed road. We determined we needed 164 of those, and we have quotes out right now. We expect a price back at any time, and then those will be here within 2 to 3 weeks.
And we don't know the status of House Bill, what is the House Bill number?
1028.
So we don't know, 1028 may actually affect where the delineators go. Is that
It could.
correct?
But we don't have to change the structure of the delineators, or, we can still use those. Did we close, public testimony except for writing?
I believe you did, Mr. Chairman. We didn't at any rate advertise it.
So, nothing further.
Not for me.
All right, I'll close staff, open it to the board.
Did we get any more written comments that came?
And maybe that, what we're doing right now, she was referring to mitigation in her testimony, so maybe that'll help with that situation. And signage. Public testimony is closed, sorry. That's why we left the writing for you.
And J.H. Green Road comment, being open to ORVs. Were you privy to that comment, Josh?
No, but I think I know what you're talking about.
About J.H. wasn't going to be an ORV route?
Yes, this was open to RVs prior to the discussion about the ATVs.
Was it just a J.H. Green Road that was open to ORVs? Or was it?
Not in that action. In that action, there were, it was the ordinance from
No, there was
2013.
yeah.
There were a lot of
Yeah.
roads open to RVs.
I'm more referring to roads leading to J.H. Green Road, I guess.
Find a map.
That offer, with it being close to ATVs, I think Tunk Road would be open to ATVs, or no? Is that right? It wasn't open either.
I think one of the discussion points that we had when we were talking about that, because we knew that that was open to ORVs, but it was cattle and just being able to use an ORV on the road to do farm work and everything like that. Because we knew that they weren't more than likely, we're not gonna just drive up and drop their WHTVs off to do any public riding, but that it was open for people to, if they needed to, do any sort of farm work or anything like that. That's the discussion I remember.
So, now I'm beginning to recall that conversation we had. It was, so to use the road by an ORV, which, after you looking to tell me if the ORVs are open on Tongue Creek Road, what you're saying is they would have to take the ORV to J.H. Green Road to ride from there. I think.
Right. And there's not a lot of, so WATVs currently are classified differently than ORVs.
Right.
So it's open to an ORV, which is just, if you got an ORV license, four-wheeler, three-wheeler,
Yep.
whatever, or you got an ORV tag on it.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the guys, I think, well, if you're farm exempt, it doesn't matter. You can
That's
ride
right.
anywhere you want.
Yeah.
But if you're
Within a
not,
25-mile radius, right?
if you're not farm exempt, and you got an ORV tag on your four-wheeler or something, and you're running cows or doing whatever, then that is why I believe that we said, you know, let's leave that open for that use. In particular, because like I didn't see the realities of somebody taking an ORV, so it wouldn't even be a WATV, it'd have to be an ORV. Haul it up to J.H. Green Road, right over to the other side where I believe it's closed to, I don't think, is there a loop on that one?
No.
The other side is open. I just got the file, so nothing on the Tongue Creek side is open. It starts at J.H. Green Road. On the other side, Hardy Road, McLaughlin Canyon, Upper Chewillican, Tallkire are all open to ORVs
ORVs.
and WATVs.
But J.H. Green Road is not.
Correct. It is not open to WATVs, but it is open to ORVs.
And that was, you know, just as for instance, Polanski's branched up there for over a century. Well, when old Ed died, old grandfather, he never had a horse on the ranch back then. He did everything but pick up tractor and jeep and all.
So doesn't that fall into the farming exemption?
They could.
You have to
Yeah,
actually,
you have to go down and get a farm exempt tag.
and you have to pay taxes on it as a farm asset.
Farm, yeah. And then then you gotta run a slow moving vehicle.
Oh, right.
And it also limits it, because if you do that, you can't get an ORV tag for it.
Right.
So you couldn't take that vehicle to Idaho or whatever if you wanted to, you might
Or ready to take it to Continental or whatever,
So
so it's a ranch vehicle.
So how would that affect it if we closed it to ORVs?
Well, then a person who was riding a four-wheeler that had an ORV tag on it
Coming from Chewillican Valley
would be illegal for them.
to cross that road
Right.
at that point.
Or anybody doing any sort of farm work or anything like that, be illegal for them to use that road.
Unless they have the farm.
It's a farm exempt.
And so probably what we're talking about then is that, just getting the full implications of it, is that, if they use their, ORV for other than farm use, and they had an ORV license for it, then they couldn't use it for farm use.
No, they can't.
No, they can't.
But you can only ride then on ORV open roads. You have a farm exempt, you can ride on any road.
Right,
You're right,
But-
on Highway 97.
Yeah, but you can only ride within 15 miles.
okay. Well, so what if we close that section for ORV? Just,
But we're not in, that's not in consideration for this particular
right.
public hearing. So,
I'm just putting that out there because I'm responding to the comment.
you know, I understand that. What I'm saying is that we could consider things like that, but I mean, in the previous hearing, that was all pretty well laid out, and we had the discussion. I mean, we could get the minutes and see if they contain the discussion, but that was a discussion I remember having.
Well,
So,
but the point being more that it, this wasn't advertised as a hearing to close ORV routes. Is that?
No, that's after, Commissioner. The action before you is to open certain identified roads. You certainly have the option of amending those to delete a road from the list that was specific to WATV, and the road is not currently open to WATV. If you wish to consider closing a road currently open to an ORV, that would be a separate action that we should notice and go through that process.
We vetted the roads with all the different agencies. And went through the list, clicked the ones off that we thought were not gonna work very well. I think that there is one thing that I think we should consider in this too, is that the Department of Fish and Wildlife did ask about pull-out, unloading areas in one of their comments. So I think that as we get into this a little bit more, I mean, that's a recreation activity. And if we're gonna support recreation activities in this county, then we need to figure out, the different things that these recreation activities need. So that's one thing that I think that we should look at in the future. But I would, do you have an ordinance number?
Would be number 3, 2019-3.
2019-3. So in light of the fact that we have ordered are the sign, the max fine signs, are they gonna be here when? Did you
It
say?
should be here by the end of the week.
By the end of the week. And we'll start putting those out
Right away.
right away. And we're gonna delineate where those signs are at on our map, is that true?
We can do that, yes.
Good. And then our other markers, we're getting the prices for them, the 165, and how long do you think they'll be here?
So once I get the quote back and we order, it's usually 2 to 3 weeks. So
And then, so as we're going out and doing road work, we're gonna start putting those in the different places where they need to be.
Yes.
The road is closed. Okay. So in light of the fact that we have all the signs ordered and are going out with the, quote for the delineators, I would move to approve ordinance 2019-3.
Second motion.
Okay, motion second, discussion.
So, the only thing that I guess that we haven't addressed, it appears to me anyway, is just that one issue I brought up. Did anybody get any other comments? Written comments?
I didn't have any to provide.
Okay, this came direct to us. And given the fact that we have to do that, we deal with that under a separate action. We have to pass that up. That's all I have.
Okay. Any further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed, same sign. Motion carried. Folks, thanks for your interest and thanks for coming, but, we're gonna go right on into our update from planning with, Mr. Huston. So sometimes you guys like to stay and visit. Could I ask you to, Dan's house a nice day, do the visiting outside so that we can conduct the rest of our business? Thank you very much for coming, and I'll close public hearing. Okay, Mr. Huston.
Well, Andy, got for equipment for item 4, let me give you an update on the third item on your agenda, the change of use forms. Now, as you'll recall, we talked a week ago about our current practice. We're using the site analysis form, a variety of different things, and that hasn't necessarily worked as smooth. So, my staff is working on a new application package for change of use. Now, what is, and we get other sorts of change of use, application, night rentals, occasionally home occupations. What of course has driven it in large part is now the marijuana farms, which in some zones are permitted. So, with that as kind of the background, we're working on the form. While we've reviewed that, there's a number of other things that have popped up that I wanted to share with the board. One of which is the whole question of your environmental review process. As you know, your environmental review process is directed by RCW 4321C, WAC 19711. And thrust of SEPA is everything is required to go through environmental review, unless there is a specific categorical exemption. So for instance, your budget is specifically categorically exempt. Personnel manuals, personnel updates, that sort of thing are all categorically exempt and very specifically enumerated, as are a variety of minor land use actions. When we're looking, and we were looking specifically in terms of the marijuana farms, and I'll have another item to share with you here in a moment under that banner. There is no categorical exemption for a permitted land use activities. There's various flexible thresholds. For instance, single-family residences are categorically exempt unless you build, I think it's over 25. Ag buildings or buildings of that sort are categorically exempt unless you go beyond the square footage threshold. If they're tied to another permit, substantial development, shoreline, something like that, oftentimes into the SEPA. There is no categorical exemption that I've been able to even creatively apply to a conversion of a particular site to a marijuana farm. So, moral to the story, even under the change of use process, which is administrative, I still see that we'll probably be required to require an environmental checklist and go through the environmental review process. That, while on paper, that might seem like a relatively minor change, in terms of expectations, that may be quite remarkable in the eyes of some. So some feedback from the commissioners would probably be helpful to us in doing that. Now, morphing into the other issue I want to share with you, you'll recall I briefed you last week on the conditional use permit up off of Windy Ridge on North Pine. They've applied for an amendment to their conditional use permit, which they received back in 2017, as I recall. Now they have reviewed the changes in the code recently adopted. They are in a zone where what they're doing would be a permitted activity. So they want to withdraw the amendment to their conditional use permit and process it as you would under a permitted activity, expansion of a permitted activity, which we can do. There's nothing to prevent them from asking that. We would, if they did that, request or require that they terminate their conditional use permit, because I don't want to get into a scenario where we have a mix of CUP and a mix of permitted activity and those sorts of things going on, which would make it difficult to track. So I'm trying to direct them one way or the other, because we do have a few other CUPs out on the landscape. They've completed SEPA. We issued a mitigated determination of non-significance. What it would change is the public hearing that would have been scheduled now would not be, which obviously will fly in the face of the expectations of some who have been involved in this process. But I've looked it over and I don't see any reason in our code or state law that they can't do what they want to do. Now, we're getting more applications through under the banner of the change of use now with the adoption of your new regulation. Of course, they had no expectation of going through SEPA. I am requiring that now under the banner of administrator of the code, SEPA responsible official, obviously subject to direction from the contrary, from those who are my direct supervisors. So that is an update in terms of your change of use process. What I'm really drilling in on now is the requirement for environmental review, in particular now for the marijuana farms converting from non-marijuana to marijuana growing. guessing Commissioner Branch is doing as I did and looking through 197,
Still, yeah, I'm
1100.
taking another glance at it, actually. Something on the line of minor land use decisions or something like that. It kind of baffles me to see the exemptions, the extent of exemptions, and there not being one where the permit is not being issued.
It's, what the Commissioner's talking about, of course, is SEPA, and while this has gotten a little more flexible in recent years, SEPA, as adopted, you don't just do SEPA. You have to have a permit to which you attach the SEPA process. Well, okay, the argument would be because we're actually processing a change of use application, a de facto permit is being issued. Now, if we didn't do that, I think it probably gives rise to the question, there's no permit when you do it SEPA. But we do a change of use review to determine shoreline jurisdiction and the critical areas and all of those other things. While it's a permitted activity in our zone, doesn't necessarily mean you don't have to get some kind of permit or meet other criteria. So what we've done is in past use site analysis, now creating a change of use form. So, but that's certainly part of the discussion that we could have.
Are there, just one question, are there other activities out there that, well, I guess I'll go to this. If the land use action itself doesn't require SEPA,
Pardon, I'm sorry?
the land use action itself doesn't require SEPA, now, without a permit to establish a marijuana grow,
Well,
it doesn't require SEPA.
Where this is also going to pop up is under nightly rentals, where in some of the zones, as a conditional use permit, we require SEPA because it's a conditional use permit.
Yes.
But we also have now the opportunity to apply for a change of use for a nightly rental. You're converting from a single family residence activity to a commercial activity for transient rental accommodation.
Which requires a conditional use.
Which as I would interpret then the environmental review laws, we would require an environmental checklist and do SEPA review on that.
Because of the conditional use permit.
Pardon?
Because of the conditional use.
Well, but not because, we would do it under the conditional use permit, maybe use.
So what if SEPA was already done, what if they're in PD?
Well, if you already have, and SEPA covers that, if you have existing environmental documents that are still relevant, you can just bring those forward. So for instance, if the plan, and we do that actually with regularity, if somebody has applied for an expansion of an operation or a change in use within an operation, or it comes up often in the PDs when I want to do a nightly rental, if the environmental review included the discussion of nightly rentals being allowed, then we just bring that environmental determination forward. We don't do it again.
So what I add on that, and this is applicable to other uses as well, if the use is allowed use in the district, and you're making a change of use from one allowed use to another allowed use, then I don't see the trigger for SEPA.
Was it, no, understood, and then certainly that's part of the discussion. For instance, we have a number of permitted activities where we've done SEPA on the building permit because we're beyond the threshold.
Right.
Yeah, but they're all permitted activities. So I guess.
But it's still, that's called out, you had a threshold that you went over.
Exactly.
So, and again, if it's one allowed use to another allowed use, I don't see the SEPA trigger. Where I see the SEPA trigger was when you made it an allowed use through the zoning change, but you did SEPA on that.
one could certainly,
That's
I mean, that's an argument that we should probably.
Because
explore.
outside of the SEPA exemptions themselves and how they're stated, I'd be curious as to if there were any other land use actions out there that were ever challenged on the basis that they changed from one allowed use to another allowed use.
I haven't done that exploration.
And so when I've dealt with SEPA in a zoning change, and I've looked at the zoning change, I've looked at it and gone, okay, these are allowed uses, and they ask the question about land use, various, what do you do about it? And I'll say, if it had actions that we identified that needed more review, that we would make a conditional use permit out of them, and I would say in that SEPA checklist that I did for the zoning change, that further evaluation would be done at the project level.
So, if I buy a piece of property, a raw piece of property over here in an industrial, let's just say an industrial area, and I want to put in a permitted activity, do you have to do SEPA on that?
Well, again, it depends on whether it matches up. I mean, the short answer is yes. You have to do SEPA on everything.
Okay, so,
Now you go to the exemptions to see if there is one.
right,
for what-
so let's say there's not an exemption for what I'm doing, then you have to do SEPA, correct?
That's my interpretation, and
So-
the are using the term permit. Maybe we should more accurately say decision. For instance, your WATV ordinance, we're not issuing a permit, but you are adopting an ordinance which implements a particular governmental action, because we determined there was no categorical exemption for that. We went through environmental review. So the action upon which a SEPA challenge could be mounted, and it was in years past, was on the adoption of the ordinance. So, and to the commissioner's point though, you know, we are reviewing a change of use. Are we issuing a permit, or are we just reviewing the proposal to make sure it's lined up?
Right, and so then the question comes up for me, it's like, well, then why not have it, make it a conditional use permit, because de facto, you're going through a permit process. And so I would submit that there's other projects out there that you, just like you mentioned, possibly some industrial use, although typically an industrial use would meet a threshold, maybe because of the parking and building size. I mean, many times they do. And that's what made the exemption go away.
Well, I guess what I was getting to was, if it's an exempted use that you're changing the use to, then don't do SEPA on it. But if it's not in the, if you're changing it to, you know, you're allowing a use, it may be a permitted use, but if it wasn't changing, if it was new, you'd have to do SEPA.
So that's the point right there, is that if the way I'm looking at it is, if I look at a project and I see that we did a zoning use chart and it said, these are allowed uses. And then later on, somebody applies, don't apply, they're just doing it. And the business license or the license with, I think, the state is exempt.
Yeah, all regulatory licenses.
That's exempt. And so to change from one use to the other, and I can even turn it around, and it might be more palatable for some, but if I had a grow and I decided to change it to a single family residence, would I require SEPA for the change of use back to the single family residence?
Well, let's use that as an example, I guess. If you kind of carry through our discussion, if you were a marijuana grow, that went away, and you want to put in single family residence.
Both allowed uses.
They're both allowed uses. You would not for single family residences until you built a certain number.
Right.
Or maybe
Until you
multi-family,
reach
maybe
more.
more.
Isn't it, or a square footage or something like that?
That was
Well,
my
it's
threshold.
units, and you're flexible. If you're doing multi-family, there's a break, you skate 25.
But I'm just saying it would be just the single family.
Just a house.
It's an allowed outright use that doesn't meet the threshold.
See, so maybe that's the question. because this is a discussion you get into in the SEPA all the time. People will look and say, well, it doesn't say I have to do it. Which isn't really the way it works. You're supposed to do it unless it tells you
Other way.
you don't. But this is, actually a pretty good example. If you were converting from a marijuana grow just to a multi-family structure, you still only get a building for that. That, the approval, if you will. If you go beyond a certain number, you gotta go through SEPA. Because there's, in the book, it tells you, and again, it doesn't tell you, you have to go through SEPA beyond this number, it says you don't have to under this number. In terms of, and we're keeping the marijuana, since that's what we're talking about, it's not, there's no mention in 4321, 9711, there's no discussion about thresholds for marijuana farms or anything else. It's completely silent in terms of that as a land use activity, so.
Yeah, and so, you know, oftentimes you wonder about levels of review for any particular use because you don't know what it's going to look like. Kind of a decision factor when you decide you're going to use conditional use permits. You go, this is a use that we don't know what it's going to look like and it has some potential impacts. We're going to make it a CUP. And then anything that you've allowed outright is typically through that process of SEPA that you do to adopt your zoning code and your comp plan for that matter, if it's in that much detail, you're considering those things and you're going, I'm allowing them outright. In your zoning code, you go, what's the environmental impact of that? Well, there's a lot of unknowns out there.
We ran in a similar, not exactly the same situation, we run into this with large lot subdivision. I mean, there's no approval per se. We review it. They're all 20 acres. They look at the map, they file it with the assessor's office, and they're done. But in the past, we were requiring, right, and we still do, large lot subdivision go through SEPA. And we've actually had essentially not a similar argument made. You're not approving anything when you're doing SEPA on. We never went to litigation, we had threat of litigation. And a variety of legal opinions on it, we never really put a fine on the question. Now, what we with exempt says, because that by our code is 4 lots or less, we call it similar to a short plat, even though you're not applying for a short plat. With exempt say, because the break for a short plat is 4 or less, we don't put the exempt 6 through SEPA, we do put the large lots through SEPA.
So if I were able to go back in time, back to when the exempt subdivisions were established or ignored or whatever happened back when, if I was making that decision in my zoning code, I'm going to adopt a zoning code and I'm going to make 20 acre exempt lots, that would be subject to a zone or a SEPA determination. And by and large today, if we were adopting that, if we didn't have that exemption, we would be appealed if we didn't address it through SEPA. We would be challenged. I mean, that's just my guess, but there's no doubt that somebody would say those divisions have an environmental impact, and you better include them in your SEPA. Given the things that we've been faced with in terms of SEPA analysis today, I would say that would happen.
Let's appreciate the discussion. I'm kind of working this out.
I know it's
in my mind here.
When we did SEPA updates with ecology about 15, 20 years ago, we had all these kind of discussions with Neil Holland, in fact, who was in charge of doing that when it all came around, and I was on the phone off and on many times, and we started to include things in there. We just very well cleared that.
Why don't I frame the question? Run it past Dave and then submit it to municipal research just to see.
That'd be a good idea.
Just to see if this has popped up anywhere else. Just to see.
And that's, you know, a big concern I have outside of this operation, marijuana operations, when anything else that pops up is, you know.
I mean, it is, to a point, it's come up in past, talking about the rest. The question of what in some people's minds is a fairly remarkable change in terms of what used to be, you know, single-family residents and now ones, like transient rental accommodations back, you know. We don't look into it too much because for the most part, no matter how it's being planned developments, they already did see Commissioner Holbert's
They're
question.
specifically called out, right?
And the rest of these haven't had that many, but in our discussion, and then we sent those letters out by the by, to the different management companies, explaining to them it appeared they had clients not in compliance with local code, and asking them to participate and help clean that up. So, assuming we have any effectiveness with that, we should get a spate of applications in for change of use, so.
Right, and so that's saying that every one of those, I mean, according to practice, which, unless you get appealed on it, we would be doing those, and then anything else that is very similar to that. That's a concern. One concern I have with that is because people will say, and I think they're right, they'll say, well, you know, you don't have a regulation on this particular thing, you have it allowed outright, and you're still gonna run a permit process on this essentially.
Well, there is that question. You do have in 17A290 a fairly extensive list of requirements and conditions that you have to meet.
Right.
Which always gives, although we have other things that do that, we still go through SEPA, but it doesn't always give rise to the question if all you're doing with your SEPA review is reciting all of the requirements in the code.
We don't want it to get this, to be this discretionary thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, which is always a concern.
That's right.
Let me do some outreach, let me do some
Yeah, I
research.
think it'd be a good idea.
Yeah, I appreciate the discussion, and I'll do some additional outreach and see what others are doing, and do some research.
You know, that question comes up because because of the nature and of the cannabis operations and the mix of views on the issue, it always has potential for appeals and problems. And so, if we even remember when we were talking about recommending denial of the cannabis and liquor permits if they didn't pay their personal property taxes.
Right.
And to me, it was like, okay, let's open up the Pandora's box here because that will every kind of use that may not be paying their personal property taxes, except there isn't that mechanism to trigger it always with bars and lounges or, you know, stores that sell liquor and then some hot issue comes up around that particular piece. And we might find ourselves.
We'll be back to you on this. We'll be back to you. We'll do a little more digging. Permit exempt wells. A couple of weeks ago, we talked about the distinction between the Campbell Gwinn restrictions, 904450, and Group B, Class A distinction in terms of whether you require water right or not. We also talked about, in part, the distinctions between the four water uses identified in 904450, 5,000 gallons a day, domestic, half acre of lawn, non-commercial garden, stock watering, and 5,000 gallons a day for industrial use. I went through and pulled up, of course, they had the Attorney General's opinion that was issued in, you remember, 16, anyway. There was, why don't you, sure, let me pull that. And then this was what chilled our practice of putting the water allocation tables and all sorts of things on our short plats and that sort of thing. Mr. McKenna issued it, pool 5. And this actually led, this
Wait,
was,
wait, wait, you go back up there and turn it again. Interpretation of statutory language exempting withdrawals of groundwater for stock watering from permitting requirements.
that was what tripped the discussion, well, actually, this is a different one. We had another one that I should've gave you. That was actually,
This could be further down.
well, that was the one that Zempel asked in Kitsap County.
Oh.
So, I'm sorry, we put the wrong one up on the board here, my fault. What, when you, in the second Attorney General's opinion, but it's related to this one, what McKenna did was go through and identify that each of those 4 was a distinct use. And in the Kim case, it reinforced that. But what has,
Do we have that in email?
Mark,
Can you email that to us?
I'll send you this and the other one.
And the other one too, please.
So, where I'm going, let me actually give you the punchline first. The McKenna and subsequent litigation has always separated them out. And when we were doing the water allocation tables, we separated them out. 5,000 gallons a day with domestic, half acre lawn and non-commercial garden, on and on. So, when we put the application tables on, we would split out the 5,000 gallons a day for in-house use, and we would divide the half acre of lawn and non-commercial garden amongst the parcels created. We didn't count irrigation water in the 5,000 gallons a day domestic withdrawal. Now, that's not at least what DOE is kind of moving back towards. We recall that discussion we had here with Trevor, when it was their consideration that part of that 5,000 would include some level of outdoor irrigation. So they're blurring the lines just a little bit. And in the write-up to the 76 rule, as I recall, they blurred the line a little bit.
Well, they specifically said single domestic, but see, that's a little bit different. So, because in that rule, it's specifically laying out what the reservation can be used for. Okay, so it says that, single domestic use is for the one household water use and up to a half acre of lawn and garden. So they actually had to put that in that definition to make sure of that, because in Western water law here, there are the stacked set of 5,000 gallon per day exemptions. But in that rule, you don't get all of those things.
No, that's accurate. Right.
And so I think they had to blur the line there to say, well, single domestic use in this is defined as normal household use plus irrigation up to half acre lawn and garden.
So where I'm going with this is, as we've had this discussion now, in terms of what to debit against the 2 CFS reserve, that's one question, I suppose. In terms of how to do your Campbell Gwinn calculations, it's yet another. So, this is that excerpt out of the aspect report, which included in-house and some level of irrigation and stock watering, all in their analysis, and came up with a number.
I think it just clicked in my brain what you're, because Campbell Gwinn, well, so in the 1945 groundwater rule, it says a permit exempt well can only withdraw 5,000 gallons per day. Now, I don't remember anywhere in the session law there stating that you could withdraw 20,000 gallons per day as long as you were using 4 different categories.
Well, but that's how it's been interpreted. And actually, it's beyond that. You can withdraw as much as you want to.
For stock.
For stock water.
Right.
There's no gallonage on half acre lawn non-commercial garden. kind of implied ceiling, and then your two 5,000 gallon tank withdrawal.
Well, so then there, that could be then differentiated. Because if you can withdraw 5,000 gallons per day for single or group domestic use, then using the amount of water consumed, now this is only for Campbell Gwinn. Using the water consumed, the maximum amount of water consumed per household, then divided by 5,000 would give you how many lots you could use. Or you would actually go to probably that would hit the group A definition, where it's 9 or less.
Well, certainly one could make that argument. That is not how we apply.
I understand that, but for the reservation accounting, so if I said, okay, well, I want a lawn and garden, I get to use the 2 CFS for my lawn and garden, but we have to debit the whole amount, 710.
Well, see, there's actually as I read the language of the rule, you're not allowed to use the reservation for irrigation, because that's actually listed in that third tier water appropriation.
So are we gonna go by?
But, there's
I understand.
interesting discussion, because the 2 CFS reserve is for domestic use and stop loss.
But domestic use is defined. Could you go on the Methow Watershed? Can you get on that? Can you get online, Lenny, and
Looking for the rule itself.
Look at the aspect watershed.
and go to the Methow Watershed Council, please. Website. And then go to Methow Plan.
Do you have the one that he's talking about the very next one?
There's, yep.
Take a look. Like you always do.
Okay. So can you project that up on the screen? Okay, so could I drive for a second, since I know where all this information is in this report? So this is the Water Resource Management Program for the Methow River Basin. December 1976. Okay, so this report was submitted, and I'm gonna go down, I'm gonna scroll down through through this, the abstract and everything, because at the end of this is the actual 173.548 rule. Okay, so this goes down through all of their findings, all of the, groundwater, public concerns, factual findings. What is it?
030.
030? 030. Okay, here we go. So here's the transmittal of rules adopted. So this was attached to that Basin report. And this is 173.548, permanent rule, order number DD 7637. There's the back. That shows everything. Okay. So those two are connected, obviously put together, the report. we go up here, we have definitions. Okay, so recommendations from the, from the people. You're right here. So, in this report, here is their glossary of terms. And right here is single domestic use. Water used by a single household, including up to 1/2 an acre lawn or garden irrigation.
That was interpretation once upon a time.
Okay, so now, so if we go to our list of uses, single domestic use specifically is the top priority.
Well, okay, so the way you're reading the, based on this, fair enough, you're reading the rule that irrigation listed.
For a
in-
1/2
in-
acre of lawn
in
and
the-
garden.
Well, they list irrigation, but you're splitting it out. You're arguing that a 1/2 acre lawn and non-commercial garden is included in the term single domestic.
Correct, by their glossary of terms.
Well, all right.
And when they say irrigation, I believe they're talking about, well, actually,
Commercial
that's
irrigation.
you can just.
Farm irrigation, that sort of
Can
thing.
you go to if irrigation is defined? No. Irrigation isn't defined in there, but I think it's farm irrigation,
Right,
because everything was pretty well allocated.
allocated at that point. Well, okay, fair enough.
Oh, will you go down for a minute? What does groundwater say there? Water in the ground lying in the zone saturation, natural recharge includes water after rainfall.
So the kind of what we're working our way into sooner or later is, and of course, what we debit against 2 CFS reserve is kind of another discussion to your point, related, but a different discussion. Then determine what you can pull under the Campbell Gwinn restriction. Because it appears, I mean, I think your analysis is accurate, according to the definitions in the rule, they bumped the 1/2 acre lawn on commercial garden into domestic use. That isn't necessarily the way the rest of the world operates.
Exactly, and that's why it makes ours harder, because in the rest of the world, under Campbell Gwinn, you had 2 different amounts of water.
Right.
So, and maybe that's why McKenna, well, see over here, it would have been the same. So, you had houses by federal standards. I don't know if you can use, Dave's here. 14 homes is on it, will you come out here for just a second? 14 homes is on a group basis?
Our population is greater than 25, served for more than 6 months a year.
Okay, but so do we use a different, because the federal, federal home occupation standard for a full-time house is 2.5 people. Do we have a lower rate here?
I think ours is a little bit, it's right there, it's 2 point something.
2.36, I think, was state health use, it worked out to 11.
11,
They made the break at 11.
okay, 11. Based on serving, yeah, which sounds about right if it's 2.
If you do the math, it works out, it's for a population of 25, which about 11.
Right, and every house built on it, doesn't matter if you think it's gonna be a temporary use or whatever, has to be for permanent use. That's in the federal
Can't,
standards.
no interruptible.
No, yeah, no interruptible. Okay, so by group B standards, less than a permit, if we had, what is our amount that Aspect says we pull out of the ground?
Go ahead, I think it's your next slide. They arrived at the average consumptive water
No,
use.
we don't care about consumptive because
Okay.
1945 doesn't say anything about consumptive. So is it, I think go back up.
So the
200?
previous slide then,
Yeah, they're using, indoor use is 200 gallons.
200 gallons per day.
Indoor use, 200 gallons per day. Okay, so based on 200 gallons per day, 5,000 homes, you could serve 20 homes, but we know that you've got to get to, that if you go over 14, you're at group A anyway, and you have to have a permit. So under the 5,000 gallon per day, 1945 groundwater rule, you could serve all 14 of those households. And also they could irrigate, because there was also 5,000 gallons a day, this is in the rest of the world now, there was also 5,000 gallons a day allowed for irrigation.
Half acre, that was by space.
Oh, maximum half
Yeah,
acre.
limited to no more than a half acre.
Okay, so what you were saying was,
What we were.
you had to divide the half acre by however many homes were on the thing, right?
So if you had a proposal where every lot was gonna have its own home, its own well, we would allow up to 14
Homes.
based upon the 350 gallons a day. That was the estimate that came out of the permit Exempt Wells work group that I was on way back in
Okay.
2009. And we would divvy up the half acre lawn and non-commercial garden. That we just literally did it by square foot. We take the 43,560 divided by 2, divided by
Right.
however many lots, and that's what we were putting on the face of the plat, unless it was in an irrigation district.
Right.
Then we didn't mess with the half acre lawn on commercial garden.
So now over there, they combine it. But does that actually change anything having to do with Western water law? I mean, with the original water law? They say that single-family domestic you can use up to a half acre lawn and garden.
Well,
But it's only serving one house,
no.
too. So do we, do we just say that we have to debit the 1,000 gallons per day? We have one well, one parcel. But we know it's a project. We know it's 1,000 gallons a day that we're pulling if they're gonna put in any sort of outdoor, or up to a half acre lawn and garden. And you only allow 5 homes based on a 5,000 gallon per day withdrawal.
I mean, that could be an outcome defensible in the end.
Because then nobody gets to,
So what, I guess now I'm thinking, would that essentially, the effect of that would end up with 2 standard in terms of applying Campbell Gwinn?
Yep.
Sam, where this is going to, and we can decide when and how we make this decision, the EIS is gonna talk about all this, obviously, in terms of trying to quantify. We'll get into it with the RIA 49. In fact, they're having the presentation from DOE at their next meeting in terms of all this. And how to essentially create your 20-year water budget is a specific task with RIA 49, but on a bigger scale, we need to figure out whether we use our historical build out or use our potential build out or some combination thereof. We still have to try to come up with a discussion in terms of the amount of water that's used. That's our EIS programmatic analysis. But we also,
actually speaks to this a little bit. There's something in this report that kind of speaks to this a little bit.
this is your discussion, Commissioners. We're working our way through things we gotta work our way through. You know, that, while you're getting ready, the distinction between Group A or Class A and Group B I don't know, I'd be interested to hear Dave's perspective on this. If you're poking a hole for every parcel, you don't consider that a group system. I realize some are arguing we should, but we haven't.
Right.
So that particular definition, the distinction doesn't come into the discussion. So now we're back solely in Campbell Gwinn, where we got into the group A, class B. For instance, Silver Spurs was actually gonna put, in the end put 11 lots on one water source. That was a permitted exempt withdrawal. Then they were going to, and did, subsequently obtain a water right for the rest of the project. So that definition was relevant, as well as the Campbell Gwinn discussion. But what triggered then there was the fact it went beyond 11, which state health says now it's a class A, you need a water right. It wasn't necessarily a Campbell Gwinn analysis. It was the definition of the break between class A and group B.
Right. So this is interesting because from what I've heard, people don't believe, well, I've heard some people say that they don't think you can get a water right for an exempt well use. But this is speaking right here, appropriation of water for single domestic supply. Issuance of water rights for single domestic supply purposes will be guided by the following SOPs. Refinement of the water right application is appropriate when the facts are available. For example, if the applicant intends only to water his lawn and garden, the use should be designated domestic supply lawn and garden watering only. On water sources where the availability of water is marginal, such as a stream that has been administratively closed, because in this also, they said that water for domestic supply, you can get it even in closed, some of the closed tributaries. Such as a stream that has been administratively closed to further appropriation for other than domestic supply or stock watering purposes. The water is available from another source. The permit may be denied on the highest feasible use of remaining waters. The logic would prevail even for household water, since denial would not be endangering health or welfare, rather it would require the applicant to use an alternative and more reliable source. Water is not available from another source, the application may be approved for in-house domestic supply only. The department's policy is that people are entitled not only to household water, but also a sufficient water to maintain a pleasant yard surrounding over and above in-stream needs, except that on water sources where the cumulative effects for domestic supply would seriously impair aesthetic or fisheries. So there's, and what is it? All applications for domestic supply shall be denied as being detrimental to the public, except to the extent that such waters are needed for household supply. And then they go on to say there are though some where on water sources where the availability of water is critical, all applications for domestic supply shall be denied. So they break it in three different things, three different categories. They say you can go in-home use and gardening or in-house use only, or no, you can't do it.
That's what could take an interesting turn in the future, where the legislature through 1691 has, at least in some respects, amended 9044-050 and also directed essentially rule writing around a set of legislatively prescribed mandates, if you will. And actually, let me put the next tie bar into the discussion. Certainly we need to, in terms of projecting our impact, we need to come up with some kind of analysis standard, if you will, for how much each house uses, how we're going to calculate all that, whether we do that through the EIS or another process or both is probably up for discussion. But when now we get into your wildfire mitigation, one of the, in fact, the most commonly stated mitigation is defensible space. Doesn't necessarily say green defensible space, but certainly that would be part of that discussion, so where it appears it's interesting, where it appears the Methow rule has already to a point kind of opened the door beyond what 9044-050 is traditionally held in terms of the allowances and restrictions, I would want to say it. And if we're poised to arguably do essentially the same thing in 49 on many different levels, the EIS is going to talk about mitigations for wildfire protection. Sooner or later, we'll come up with a number.
Well, no, that's what I was thinking, was that, you know, maybe if you're up, maybe you only get five lots if you're up in a, you know, in the wooey or something like that.
Yeah.
And as you get closer, if you can go to indoor house use only.
I've always interpreted 9044-050, although reading the other Attorney General's opinion, which is saying to you, kind of opens the door to a question of consumptive use. I've never really viewed 9044-050 as dealing with consumptive use. It was a permit level. If you pull more than 5,000 gallons a day, you get a permit. If you don't, you don't. Doesn't talk about how much you put back versus how much you pull out or anything else. It doesn't, I've never interpreted it as saying you can withdraw 10 as long as you put 5,000 back. I've only viewed it as a permitting threshold. You get more than 5, you get a permit. It's all said.
Putting it back turns into a mitigation, and then that mitigation actually identifies how that's getting put back.
Well, as you say, for mitigations, obviously it's a relevant discussion. You know, you're pulling it out, but how much is going right back in, therefore how much do you have to make up for?
Well, I mean, they were intelligent when they wrote it. I mean, they didn't want a bunch of people just drilling a big giant well and going, oh, it's permanent exempt, I'm gonna feed my fish cleaning facility on it with pumping 1 million gallons a day out.
10,000 acre orchard.
Yeah, exactly.
The discussion that we're having, you probably deduced by now, is twofold. One, writing the EIS and as much thinking out loud as anything else in terms of the things that we're going to have to review. But the other, until such time as we get to those decisions, we still have project applications to deal with. So, you know, and we've done it different ways. Now, we haven't had very many big ones for a long time. So most of the 2-lot, 3-lot short plats, where really no matter what number you probably still within the Campbell Gwinn restrictions. But this was the aspect analysis. Let's pull up the DOE. Just to look at. This is your Department of Ecology analysis. 59 gallons per 60. They rounded it 2 per, so per person, which probably is pretty close to the 200 gallons a day. You figure on the
2.3,
2.35. So they all are, you know, plus or minus fairly close in terms of in-house use. But we will eventually need to cross that bridge to decide if, like apparently in 48, consider some level of outdoor irrigation as part of your domestic withdrawal. Are we going to then use that in our Campbell Gwinn analysis? Is that going to be strictly for debit against the reserve, or we use a different standard for Campbell Gwinn? Is kind of part of the question that I'm wrestling through.
Well, it's funny how it morphed, because if you think of, you know, back then, parcels were parcels. You go and drill a well, and you got 5,000 gallons a day. That's a lot to serve a house in 1945. That's a lot of water. But I don't think, you know, I don't think there was ever this idea that there was going to be so many people on this planet that, you know, there wasn't going to be available parcels for people to go in permanent exempt well.
Well, and that, I mean, the dissent in Campbell Gwinn essentially talks to some disdain towards what DOE has historically at the time Campbell Gwinn was 2002. They'd done historically. They didn't allocate amongst the project the 5,000 draw, you did whatever you were doing, and everybody poked a hole and drew water out, and life was good. It was with, Rick Ward's Attorney General opinion in 96 or 7, I don't remember now, that laid the foundation, the subsequent Campbell Gwinn decision, the 5-4 vote, where that was when they bunched everything up under the project, which we have subsequently done, not to the extent some would prefer us to, but I think to the extent that Campbell Gwinn directed us to. For instance, Martine Trust, Silver Spurs, they were all large lot subdivisions, but we still applied to Campbell Gwinn. Well, again, I'm not looking for direction or decisions today. This is part of our ongoing discussion. I'm gonna have a Department of Planning Commission tonight as I introduce to them the issues that so far we're writing the environmental impact statement around, and some of the things that they will be asked to weigh in on as they review the comprehensive plan. And
Yeah, I mean, I think
policy
that's
attached to that.
I think it's a big part of it that says that if you're gonna water a half acre long, that you're gonna use, 1,000 gallons per day.
That's what the
Because
aspect
then that
study
goes
was.
to, okay, well, if you're up in the, if you're up in the hinterlands and you have to worry about fire and you know that you're gonna be watering outside, that you're gonna limit it to the 5 parcels, because that, you can only pull 5,000 gallons a day.
Which is a lot of water.
Well, so this is interesting, it's not really that much water, and I actually
So-
asked, well,
Okay, but it is relative to how you look at it.
well, I asked, so the Watershed Council is getting some needs for me to study on a grant. And I asked him to put some on my house, because I have my irrigation, separated from my in-house use. Because I know how much pressure I'm running, and I know how big my nozzles are, and I know how much water I'm using, and it is quite a bit to water half an acre of lawn and keep it green. So,
You should go to me.
well, I got,
I'm down to like a quarter of a gallon.
I was using water in 3/4 of an acre for a long time, and part of it was on Untitled.
Yeah, I use those little mini,
Yeah.
just a mining amount of water and water at night all the time.
But if I was using 5,000 gallons a day, the bill would be phenomenal.
Yeah,
luckily I don't have a meter water.
yeah, our water's metered as well.
But I definitely know that if, that my use is good, so they're not gonna be able to limit my use based on me not using my water.
Yeah, but I mean, just the 5,000 gallon exemption alone applying only to domestic uses,
Well, why?
because that's a lot of water straight domestic use. 5,000 gallons a day.
But they had it, remember that it's 5,000 gallons a day for single or group domestic. So maybe they just said, hey, we gotta make sure that we account, and I don't know, this is 45. We gotta account for a group use. What do we think that's gonna be? Well, it's gonna be about 5,000 gallons a day. Okay, so let's not make a whole big deal about it, and let's just say, okay, any permit exempt well, you just get 5,000 gallons a day, no matter what. We know that a single domestic use is not gonna pull that much, but we have to account for the group use.
And
Yeah, I use 300 gallons a day to water my lawn.
Pretty good.
and
How
then-
big's your lawn?
Too big.
Mine's too big.
Yeah, I got,
Do you ever write in on water?
1,000 square feet.
Okay,
Not sure.
mine's a half acre,
That's the
cause I know,
big.
well, not quite a half acre, I know how big my lot is. And it goes on, it's a pretty good measurement of what a half acre lawn use.
On a related subject, Commissioners, you recall we've been pursuing a grant to create our well tracking database. And at the last Watershed Council meeting, ASPEC unveiled their update to, there's a well tracking database per se. It's more geared toward tracking the two CFS reserve, but kind of birds of the same flock.
Let's make sure though that we, that they don't put the wells to the parcel.
But that said, they're
Right?
saying what,
They're tracking the number of parcels, what type of parcel they are, what's the use of the parcel, and things like that. So they are making some assumptions because but DOE does not have parcel numbers on their well logs, so
Yep.
I blame that on them.
yeah, and then in our past discussion, you recall the project we envisioned was to eventually try to tie every well log, if you will, to the parcel on which it's being used. Figure out which ones were replacement, which ones are under a water right. It was an ambitious program. Aspect didn't do that, nor are they going to. But what they did generate was their it's essentially a model where you can, if you will, turn off or turn on certain assumptions to then calculate whatever you're looking for. How many developed parcels could be created, or excuse me, how many parcels could be created from non-developed parcels based on underlying zoning. Now, as my staff points out, I've chatted with them about this.
And let's make sure that we give a little bit of backstory. So my thought was, instead of us trying to take this grant money and wells back together for over here, well, be for 49, 47, 50, 51, well, basically the whole county.
We have seven RIAs in the county.
I don't know the number.
We go out, I mean, this tool is already developed, basically. Go out with an RFP, whatever we need to do, to basically add on to this database and have the exact same thing done in over the whole county.
Now, one thing I'll share with you that maybe you knew or didn't know, I don't know. Your GIS department was heavily involved with Aspect in putting this update together.
I did know that.
So they know what they did.
Yeah, so it's 6 to 1, half a dozen. I mean, their access database is already built and all of the coding is already done.
See, I'm told theirs is a little handier, the way they have it set up. So they're, what the Commissioner and I were chatting about is it would be a wonderful facilitator for doing the EIS if we had this work in place for the other RIAs. Because then, I mean, literally, it's a manipulable model. You can put in your assumptions or gauge the effects of the decisions that you
Yeah, you
make,
can
essentially
turn off-
real time.
Yeah, you can turn your 1 acre zoning off and go, oh, this is how many lots I have.
So there's some advantage to that. We talked with Vanessa, it's not a final decision, but she seemed to think the Department of Ecology would consider that all within the boundaries of what we were going to get for our $60,000. We have $60,000 set aside. And I think I reported out to you, DOE was skeptical, and I'm not convinced we'd get it all done either. For $60,000, doing all of the ground truth that I envisioned with our well tracking. So,
And kind of what I heard from them was, if there's acceptable science involved in these models, that, they would look at it.
they would look
as
at
the
it.
count.
So the $1 million question, is the board interested in me modifying the grant application to see if we can't generate this database throughout the county? Right now, it's only in 48.
And county well tracking.
Well, it will not, well, I don't know, I guess I don't know how much it might cost. There's money left over, I suppose we could still
So
try to
they,
do some of our ground truth thing, but that's not what they did.
right, but the information is there, actually. If there was a parcel number tied to the well log, the information got put into the well log information.
They don't actually do that, I thought they always put the parcel number
They
on the
do.
well log.
They're all filed by parcel number now.
Well, the
Now.
new ones.
Right, the newer, we've been doing it for many years for them, because we have a huge GIS database with the wells
Yeah.
plotted by parcel.
Hubbard knows better than I, but while we get into the quarter section, we actually have to dig around a
Like
little bit.
domestic wells
We've been doing it for decades.
with parcel numbers in a database?
Yes. And
So I
GPS
wa-
coordinates of where the wells located exactly.
Okay, so I wonder, Aspect probably does not know that you have been doing that. So I wonder if instead of using, or in a combination with, because they're using DOE's well logs, which don't have them. If they tapped into your database and it does have, it would assign way more, well information.
I mean, and
Usually DOE would, I mean, does
You
DOE,
didn't design the database, did you?
it's just the GIS database that was created,
By DOE.
no, it was created by us.
Okay. And
So
you
we
then
populated
attached
it.
it, okay.
Yeah, because they pay us to do the well site inspections, once it's drilled or while it's being drilled. We report tag numbers, notice of intents. GPS.
That's how we got more information than they had.
They're in use or not in use? Both?
We don't know, at the time they're being drilled, so normally they're not
Okay,
in use
so-
yet.
That's more later stuff than.
And it's
I
been
mean, there's a lot of
over
wells
a
out
decade,
there.
so we've got a pretty well populated.
well, how often do you encounter in our search for well log when it doesn't have parcel number?
Oh, yeah, a lot.
But she's
Right.
using DOE's database.
Right.
Yes.
That's our proprietary database. That's what I'm saying. There might be actually,
And then you recall, we talked about.
They're probably older well logs also.
We talked about more from public health stuff over as part of the project into what we're doing to try to tie it all together. But you also have, as part of the project, we also have water sources not have anything to do with it. There's surface springs, all sorts of fascinating things.
Right,
We
yeah.
wanted to tie all that together.
but there's also water rights that
Some
are
of the wells are
associated
tied
with
to
those
water.
parcels too. I mean, you go on DOE's website for water rights and they actually have, here's a well and it's to irrigate 0.1 acres of lawn, whatever, lawn gardens. And I think they were using a lot of that stuff. I mean, we're never gonna be, and I'm like you, I like data to be as perfect as you can possibly get it because you get the best answer. But there comes a point where you go, okay, is it even possible to go back to, all of these wells and to try to ground truth all of this information? Or is it better to get the best possible number that we can using the best available science that we have, which is not necessarily having the well logs have the have parcel numbers. But if we can get more information from public health, we can too.
For purposes of DEIS, to your question, no, we don't need to knock on every door and figure out where they're getting their water. For purposes of the project we had in mind, that would have eventually been the last phase, where the parcels, you just couldn't hook to anything, or conversely, the well logs couldn't hook to anything. You'd actually go out in the field, and maybe it run off the place or whatever, but anyway, you'd go out and actually try to ground truth something. That was phase 6 or whatever we had identified, if there was money left, we would do that. So, so in terms of the end-all desired outcome for the well tracking program as we envisioned it, that would have to happen. In terms, we need to know now, not necessarily. That's a level of detail we perhaps just don't need there.
And some of them would merge for some reason or another. Someone will be voicing a concern about a well, and that's where I found a few. There's a well over there and it's got the cover off of it, and somebody might fall in it and you go, there's 3 of them over there. They're not being used. There's industrial sites that have wells on that all of a sudden somebody gets the idea that they want to use that well for something. They know it was a productive well, it hadn't been used for 20 years. I know where there's a few of those. And so they pop up, and people actually believe that where the Water Rights Act is still doing good stuff as well. But I wouldn't go try to track those down. Because
So we wanna use the money, which I think we get a lot of bang for a buck out of it, because the database is already built. They would just have to go in and do the land analysis.
It'd be a question of taking what they've done, expand it to the other items.
I think it's worth doing.
And say that, they lure for me, I'm self-serving, they lure for me is, that's an extra set of hands doing what my staff is currently doing, when they're doing that and not doing something else. So when we get into actually manipulating those numbers to deal with the alternatives, is what it comes down to. The practical application of that, we review the alternatives we've identified and what that means in terms of potential changes in zoning, for instance. With that tool, you can literally turn it on and off and cook the numbers right there.
You're using these terms, Perry, that probably are
Alter.
manipulated.
Manipulate and cook are probably not too good.
Review different alternatives. Now, those numbers are projections. The historic build out is what it is. I mean, we don't need to modify or review that. I mean, we can what if it to death. But the other numbers, we're gonna have to do some, we won't say manipulate, we'll say
Some viewing of different alternatives.
assess impacts then. But that's what it comes down to. For instance, neighborhood commercial, 5,000 square foot lot. If with a toggle, we can pull Wakanda out of that, your numbers will change remarkably in terms of the potential lot creation. Now, whether buildable or no is a whole other discussion, but in terms of lot creation, that we can do that, but we have to do it. You have to get in and change your queries, and come up with a different number. The way they have it set up with the list, you literally just turn it on and off.
Well, and you could actually use that as a what if for relinquishment.
As an example.
Some
Okay, we're 1 minute for a public hearing, guys.
Well, I'd say it's an ongoing discussion, commissioners, what have it again. And
So
I'm
I think that we were, yes, let's use the money to,
it sounds like there's some interest in that. I mean, I'll have to modify the application. But we had it set aside.
It sounds very valuable to me for us to be able to evaluate actually what we have. This is another tool.
We need to clock for this one. Okay. Thanks, Dave.
Welcome, sir. One of these days, I'm gonna get to hear a WRIA 48, WRIA 49 update, one of these days. I mentioned it once, Commissioner Coleman baited me with it every time.
Okay, 3 o'clock. We have a public hearing. No, there we go. 3 o'clock, we have a public hearing. Tonasket Airport overlay, and I'll open it up to staff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioners, for your record, I'm Perry Huston, Director of Planning and Community Development for Okanogan County. What you have in front of you is an ordinance that, if adopted, would amend the county zone map by creating overlays over the existing zoning, in this instance, around the Tonasket Airport. Why don't you go to the map, if you please. Now, this work came out of an airport advisory committee that was created, 8 years or so ago, with the idea of reviewing the airport and the surrounding areas for what a growing concern was to be incompatible uses. Now, a lot of the impetus behind this discussion was from the then city administrator for OMAC, and they were getting a lot of complaints from surrounding property owners around the airport, in large part because of the changing nature of the air traffic in and out, and disturbing, if you will, their quiet enjoyment of the property. So the Airport Advisory Committee did 2 things. It created a text section in the code, which was eventually adopted as 17A300, and created maps. So each of the cities, with the exception of the one state-owned airport, in the Methow, they're all owned by the cities. And the city, while they have incorporated the airport proper as an island, which are allowed by law to do, the surrounding area fell under county jurisdiction in terms of the zone. So you have on the books now the FAA zones, and for the most part, the configuration of these zones is consistent with that, but not entirely. So for instance, at Tonasket Airport, you have your approach and your takeoff zones, but because of topography, you'll know if they're skewed just a bit. Might be straight in, straight out. What this would do if adopted is inform and in some cases restrict the use within these different zones from what is currently allowed in the underlying zoning. So why don't you go to the zone, or the code section itself. I'm sorry, I think I said 301, but I don't believe that's accurate, it's actually 300. 301 is the existing one. 300 is the one that shows the different zones. Zone 1 flight operation, Zone 2 approach departure, Zone 3 transition, 4, 5, etc. So why don't you go down to the zone section, pick one. So Zone 1 flight operations. The permitted uses are direct, now this is actually within the airport proper. Flight operations are direct aviation related facilities, terminal buildings. You're allowed offices, charter services, going down through parking areas, storage yards. Permitted agricultural uses include the raising of orchards, row crops, etc., etc. Conditional use, gravel pits, density, Zone 1 flight operations. When you get into Zone 2, you have more recitation of things that are allowed or not allowed. I believe in Zone 2 we begin, in Zone 2, for instance, under density, irregardless of the underlying zone, you're restricted to 5-acre lots or larger. That to put all this kind of in a policy statement, what the intent of the regulation does is to avoid putting things out there that would pose a hazard to flight operations, bird attractants, electrical signal interference type of activities, things that would attract large groups of people, density, residential density in excess of your 5-acre. You have your houses scattered with some open space. That was the objective. So the text was adopted into the zone code in 2016, but without the actual amendment to the zone map, we're still operating under 301, which is the FAA regulation. With the adoption and the end game, if you will, is with the adoption of your surrounding all of the existing airports, 301 would go away. It'd be repealed off the books and everything would be regulated then under 300. So that in a nutshell is what this proposal is all about. Now, let's talk process. We went out with a SEPA determination, went through that process. We went through the Planning Commission hearing. We had no attendance, including by the city. We did send out, we published notice, and we sent out a mailer to all the property owners advertising the Planning Commission hearing. I believe I reported out that we sent out a second mailer for this hearing that is inaccurate. In responding to my question, they were confused. First mailer, a second mailer did not go out. Now the notice of public was sent over on the 28th of February, which would have published in the next week. So that was the public notice given. We're not generating a lot of feedback. on this. Now, it might be because,
It is an exciting one.
it might be because it's just not causing any concerns. It might be because people don't understand, well, this first one we've gone out with was Tonasket. So in the end, I guess I leave it to the commissioners to kind of gauge, your comfort level with what relatively small amount of feedback we've gotten. Whether you wish to continue the hearing and send out that second mailer to make sure, or, I mean, we can talk about that. There's no time sensitivity per se, other than the cities want to move the discussion.
Did the mailer say the county commissioners are, oh no, because you didn't send it out for this one, did you?
All that went out was the notice that the planning commission was conducting a public hearing to consider. There was no letter explaining what it meant or anything like that, which may be something to.
How restrictive, what's the difference in restrictions of the new zoning versus the old zoning?
The biggest, or if you will, the most impactful change would be the change in lot size. If you're currently in an R1 zone, why don't you pull up the zone map?
And are those bands of designation the same, is that the map?
That was what you would have done. If you.
So currently, what's on the books right now?
Well, what's on the books now is just your FAA regulation. All it talks about is bird attractants and radio signal interference, mostly height.
And is that it right there?
Or vehicles and structures.
It's typically just penetrations into those your height thing.
Yeah, so the FAA regulation, while it comes up from time to time when you're talking about towers, cell towers, occasionally a building's tall enough to attract their interest. That's essentially the impact of the FAA regulation.
Is that the FAA right there? It looks like it.
Okay, those are your FAA, we were unable, or haven't at this point taken the proposed zones, correct me if I'm wrong, and walked them over.
Superimpose them.
Yeah, so, but it gives you an idea.
Is that map from that GIS mapping that you can click on it and actually determine a general elevation that you've made? The rigs themselves look like that?
Yes.
Yes,
Because
good,
that's,
okay.
it's what was made however many years
Yes.
ago, yeah.
So, in the, I believe it was zone 3, you have a minimum lot size of 5 acres. Now, that would not impact the blue or the light blue, but it would impact the yellow.
So, but I'm having a hard time with the, okay, so this one's the FAA, and so you got the
Let's go back.
one, okay.
Sorry.
So inside there, inside the racetrack there is zone 1, is that true, in the biggest portion of the, inside, will you move your cursor down, please? Up, 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 okay, what zone is that right there?
Go back to the other map. Okay, so the, I bought a new pointer and I'll leave it somewhere else. So your red is zone 1, 2 your approach zone, 3 inter transition. Now in the code, go back to your code for a second. And let's see, density is what I'm looking for. So zone 3 densities allow subdivision of property for lots 5 acres or larger. So why don't you go back now to the map for zone 3. That's your, back out a little bit.
Okay.
So now go back to the zone map.
Okay, where's,
So, yeah, okay, in this case, it wouldn't have a lot of impact.
we
Which
have
may be,
less impact, right?
which is,
Because-
well, in the, right now, yeah, in that zone. it's
Because
worth-
you're in zone 1 here, is that,
R5,
Too many colors.
it's R5.
That R5, so what's the
Way
agricultural
over in that side is
This is our 20,
Okay,
and this is our 5.
that's our five.
And
Now,
it's
let me ask
R1.
you a question though. Is the outer ring of this the same size as the other map?
So I think it's tilted a little different if you look at it.
Is this bigger?
It appears bigger, but I don't know that for sure. Because
I
this,
cannot make,
it's
I
about the
can,
same.
I mean,
this was done in
So,
2012.
when the zones were created, I believe they did use the transitional overlay.
The outer ring.
Yeah, so it's got to be, we gotta be looking at the same scales.
They started with it, that's accurate,
And then they made some changes.
and they made a few changes. The outer line is probably the same.
Right.
It's the inner lines that are probably moved around.
right, so, okay, so if the outer line is the same, okay, so we look at the very outer ring to the very inner ring, that width, right there in Tonasket proper, and then right around covers a lot of R1 zoning, right?
Yeah, but there's elevation separation there.
In this one.
In Okanogan, same thing.
Well, no, I know that, but what I'm asking is, okay, so in, those are each zones, right? So we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, is that correct? Or is it
Those
one?
aren't zones.
No.
Those
So that
rings
would
don't
translate
represent
to zone
zones.
5 on the other map. These 5 rings
Yep.
would be the same as this big area right here.
Okay, that's what, okay, so what is that area zoned for currently versus what it's being?
So go back to the code. And look
So
under
it's
density.
zone 5.
For zone 5, I think it's underlying zone. Then go to density.
It is determined by
Right here.
underlying,
Oh, there it is, all right.
So it's the.
so it doesn't change it.
So it doesn't change it in the outer ring.
Okay, so this is changing very, very few properties then, because we go back to the color map,
The zoning one.
okay, there's a zoning one. So the inside ring there, there's what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
So in terms of
There's
zone,
like 14 parcels there that are R1.
perhaps.
Okay, now if we go back to the other map, okay, those parcels look to be in that green area kinda.
Approach.
Okay, so what is the green area?
So go to the code.
Right, so,
Or is it 2? Density, 5 acres or larger.
okay, so that's already, okay, but in our zone map right now, they can do it as one.
Some of it appears
In R1.
that would be.
So you only have about 14 parcels there that are theoretically getting changed, it looked like.
Well, but then each individual airport has its own anomalies. Tonasket Airport, for instance, on that approach zone to the south, they already tried to develop that, couldn't get water. Tonasket Homestead, it's gone. But it's gonna be agricultural on into the future, and if you go out the other end, that's Gary LaSantis's property, and that stays in the family, and it's just ranch land.
No, I understand that, I'm just trying to figure out from what, because there's been so little public involvement.
We had public involvement when we were going through the process.
In fact, in Oroville, we had extra.
We had a bunch of them come in from Okanogan.
This is in your two wheelhouse, so I'm gonna.
Well, no, I mean, I didn't, and you have every reason to ask those questions.
I know that,
So.
I guess what I'm saying is, or what I'm asking is, do we need to extend this public hearing out?
I don't think so.
If you want to recap some of the stuff that was done, first of all, committees that where they were made up primarily of pilots for that initial group. And every one of those people had not just the airport in mind, but they had the impacts of the neighborhood in mind too. I mean, we had a long conversation on that. And then it depended on the airport, but there was a hearing, because there was a hearing on interim control. It was on it was a moratorium on development until we got that.
Mhm.
Now, there's where the rubber meets the road.
Yeah, that's where the rub came, as soon as that we stopped the moratorium for, until we got done with the study.
And most of that, was relative to the Okanogan Airport. And there were developments being proposed as we were going through that. In fact, the tractor company over across they were relocating there, they were planning on it, they hadn't got there. And so there were some developments out there that were being contemplated that, were concerned. Not saying the whole thing would have affected it, but that's what happened. And then, in Orville, an interesting phenomenon took place where one of the realtors ran out and told everybody that the city of Orville was rezoning the area. And they were told a lot of different things, and so a lot of people came in to learn that the city of Orville couldn't rezone it, first of all. And it was way early in the discussion, so we had some conversation about that. And there were some interesting suggestions, like you should move the airport and things like that. But there was some sort of advocate for development in that area. You would get a lot of people in here because there's Orville's area was looked at by some realtors as the jewel of the Okanogan, as far as development and views are concerned. So yeah, there were issues there was lots of orchardists out there that were thinking about converting the property. But the other part of all this conversation is there's a whole book, and a whole, in fact, there was a guy that came here from State Aviation and did workshops on this subject. And all of this stuff that came about based on some modeling that the State Aviation had done. So is it controversial, will it be? And on the other side of the whole thing is this issue with air shut down as a result of the conflict of land use at the airports. So much so that if you go way to the other end of the spectrum, Seattle Airport, billions of dollars probably, maybe not billions, but I'm sure millions, were spent just doing all kinds of sound pre-mitigation to protect their airport. So that in the end, when they got challenges, they were able to deal with it because the investment was made in that airport. So that's where this all about, though, is really the investments in the airports and these occasional challenges that the airports get as far as noise is concerned primarily.
Questions of staff, Commissioner? Anything else we can show you?
And I think appropriately, or not, the simplest one was chosen first. Jim knows wife had been to that airport. That there's not a lot of development. There's large landholders there. There's the mountain on one side, that to the right of the runway as we were looking at it, there's a mountain there. Whitestone Mountain. And on the other side, there's a lot of grazing and that kind of thing, which doesn't affect the operations of the airport. Things like water bodies. There's a golf course contemplated at the north end of Orville's airport that had water features planned in it, and there was discussion about that. So there's been a lot of discussion. That's probably why Jim's reluctant to go much further with.
It's just,
Sounds like
this is the easiest one. And I think we've vetted it through the process, and we've gone through the discussion, and I just don't see any reason for more redundancy. I mean, it's our first one, and we'll get a start, and see what happens. And we know we're gonna have problems with Okanogan. We know we're gonna have problems with Orville. We know we're gonna have a certain amount of problems with OMAC. And when you go to the Methow, you're gonna have problems.
Okay, good.
So, it's gonna be a work in progress, and, but if you don't address the problem, and you don't do these airport overlays, just as Chris mentioned, we've seen the problem nationwide in big metropolitan areas, you know. California's got humongous battle going on all the time for airport approachment. Everybody wants to build around the airport, but as soon as they get there, then they don't want an airplane flying.
The OMAX is a big one for that, but the Ordinance is too. Go online and you can find some benefit studies, cost benefit studies for these, every one of the airports.
Yeah, yes, I definitely know that because I know how many tourists come into Twist, actually.
And then some of the pilots that we worked with came just from the view that it was pilot safety. You know, what kind of things would be there that caused problems there. The other side of it, there's been the one section of the code that has dealt with the height issue primarily is height. It's been in effect for a very long time, but at the same time it was in effect, there was a lot of, nobody knew who's the administrator, if you will. They were building things in places that they ought not, and sometimes that ended up with penetrations of that airspace. Orville's an example of it. Their own industrial.
Again, a lot of the other things, you know, I've flown for 50 years. And you're constantly aware when you go to an airport, you know, and I've been to many, but Spokane, if I have approach or departure problem, I already know where I'm going. I'm not going into the residential area.
You've been there.
Yeah, you look for the open space, put it in the river. You know, and the same thing like Okanogan, you got that separation, Tonasket, you got the separation from the dense population. Yeah.
The other issue that, in Orville, there's two things. There's a irrigation district, put a water cover out.
Yep.
Right up.
And then the house.
And then a house right
Yep.
at the end. And then the city actually, we put it was marginal. And we used that map that you showed with the rings on it because I think those rings actually had elevations attached to them. So Gene can go and click on those and tell, trying to work, something to raise your awareness of what's going on there. You better measure the height and start figuring out where you were. But we had a company that did a sinus collection system, and they put a hopper out there that didn't protrude into the airspace until they had to modify it. So they stuffed a cone in it because it wasn't working right, and then they were open. And so whenever they do those airport improvements, especially if they're getting FAA funds, they're dubious airports, they're in the states or the federal system, that's when they discover it. Next thing you know, you're looking at your airport plan and it says penetrated space, and it's like, man, you gotta come up with something. Orville, in fact, just because of the setbacks from the runway were not abided by, they have to shift that runway now 100 feet, which is quite a big, expensive, ongoing project. But at least they're rebuilding a runway surface that didn't have much underneath it before.
Yeah, they can use the old one.
But there's where you had a lot
Kind
of.
of similar almost, you know, some of these problems like smoke and release situation. FAA, if nobody's told them they have to move it, Forest Service just used that as an excuse because of inner politics that wanted to move the base. Actually, right there where the admin shack and everything is, the very, very safest place on an airport is the very middle of the airport.
Except for the terrorists.
Yeah.
Commissioners, if there are no further questions of staff, I go to public comment. Some of the folks here might have something to add to the discussion, then we can pick up next step.
Okay, so full staff, open to public. Any public comment?
Can I do one?
Sure.
I didn't sign in.
That's all right.
No, well, I wasn't going to say anything, but.
When we have these where there's very, very minimal, public comment, we don't go to the timer and we kind of.
You can go to the timer. Mine's gonna be real short
Okay.
anyway. Tonasket is the easiest one out of all these plans, and, I'm Salley Bull. And.
State your name for the record.
Huh?
State for the record.
Yeah. Save my name, so yeah, the Tonasket one's the easiest one, I'm sure that's why nobody showed up to contest anything. There's an elevation difference of about 200 feet from Weberville down below, and the port above. Weberville does have the Mennonite church and school, and so that was the only concern I had, but, it's still a big parcel there. What are you gonna be, like 500 feet above it as you're coming in, you're not coming in nice and low?
There's the pre-existing, I'm sorry for interrupting you.
No, go
But
ahead.
The pre-existing non-conforming uses are acknowledged in the area, so we don't have to, doesn't mean we have to move.
Okay, good
No,
deal.
exactly.
They were the ones who were most concerned beforehand, was whether they'd have to move their property. That's it. You're gonna have an exciting time with Oroville's airport, I'm sure.
I hope that's not your fault.
No, I didn't do it. But that's it, yeah, go ahead and approve this one.
All right, thank you very much. Any other public comment? Okay, hearing none, we'll open it up to the board. Close public comment.
You know, I have no further concerns about this. It didn't really change a lot, really, from the Tonasket Airport area. And the uses, you noticed how many uses were still listed in that area, which is a concern for the towns when they're looking at, a lot of people are looking at airports for their economic development. And some may go there and some may never go there. That was one piece where people get concerned about whether they can put businesses there and that.
I have no comments.
And I guess one other comment was that none of the zoning that we applies within the incorporated boundaries unless the city adopts that.
No, that's accurate, Commissioner. City zoning remains the same in the county, unless they take a parallel action. Well, Commissioners, if your inclination is to consider an ordinance to adopt this proposal, you do not have a draft in front of you because I wanted to hear the discussion, to craft and recite your findings, if you will. So if that's your inclination, I might suggest you continue your hearing for 2 weeks. And I will put in front of you a draft ordinance for your review.
Are you suggesting in the continuation of the hearing that we still take written comment?
I don't believe that. I mean, by your discussion, you seem satisfied with the information at your disposal. The only reason I would suggest continuing the hearing is because you'd be looking at an ordinance you have not seen before.
Gotcha.
So if you wish to make amendments or something similar to that, I think it would be better if you did that in your public hearing format.
Okay, so I'll close public comment, open it back up to the board.
So I have moved to direct staff to prepare an ordinance for the adoption of the Tonasket Airport zoning overlay.
Second.
Motion, second, discussion. Hearing none, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
I would move to continue the public hearing
2 weeks.
April 8th, 1:30, or whatever time.
April 8th.
Oh, no, you have the court in there. That's right.
So
Do
have
we
a
need 2
15th.
weeks?
I might need 2 weeks.
You might. Okay.
Okay, March, let's see,
The 15th of
8th, well, we could do it on the 9th.
No.
The court's in here too, on the 8th and 9th,
Days,
both?
yes,
So 15th at 1:30?
that would be the next day.
We're not in.
There's no big
rush, right?
rush. Good.
Okay, so I would
6 years.
move to continue the public hearing until, Monday, April 15th, 1:30 PM, to review the ordinance.
I second the motion.
Motion second, discussion on that.
The only thing I'd add is that thanks to two motions, because I think it's a little easier to work out that second.
I can take cues.
Any further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor? Aye. So we have a continued public hearing,
Thank you, Commissioners.
and you can get the clock ready. Thank you.
You could even notify the city of Tonasket planner, and they could come here and just thank us anyway.
Yeah.
Inside.
We'll do more outreach. Brewster, just for the sake of the information, is where we're going next. We've already started the baseline work for that one. The mayor prepared things ready to go. We'll initiate the SEPA review and get that out. You have the same planning staff attached.
Yep.
To Brewster asked to National, so Brewster asked. That's no matter what. But we'll coordinate. Because we have a busier place down around Brewster, may generate more interest.
And for the benefit of anybody that heard that comment, it's only because the planner for those communities been hounded very for a while to get this done.
He
And
reminds
some
me
of us.
quite often that every time I see him, he goes, yeah, I know.
I'll enjoy getting.
One more thing off our bucket list.
Very good, thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you.
Your next item, and Commissioner Holber, I misspoke. My staff told me we were ready to post the ground water restricted areas. It's not actually on the website. So, what we have is, we're talking 48, the restricted areas. We're continuously being asked to put something on the website, excuse me, for people to look at. So what they've done is taken the assessor's overlay and laid the map files, shape files, whatever the proper term is, I'll defer to my technologically advanced people for that, on top of that. Now the color coding, red are those areas that they have reviewed. So these are the boundaries, if you will, fresh off the press. The yellow has not been reviewed. So it's in those areas, if they're close to the boundary, we generally suggest to them that they wait until DOE's completed the review. They're well outside of the boundary, well out away from the restricted surface water, keeping in mind that's the actual tributary that's closed, not the basin.
I have a question on that. There is one thing, and most of them are up high, but all of the lakes that are closed, are those on this map too?
Well, I don't recall that the lakes have an area.
Then that's what I was wondering.
Do they?
The lakes have an area.
I mean, some of them are listed, Patterson Lake, Harrison Lake.
Okay, well, if they're on there, then they're on there. Cause the other ones are like oval lakes and all those other ones that are up in the.
So all the lakes that are closed are within these areas.
To my knowledge, although I haven't compared the list in third.
Fair enough.
You just double check on that too.
Okay, and will.
Just make sure that there's no weird little,
Yeah,
I mean, looking at it, it looks like they are now that you asked.
good.
Because we have the little.
What are the lakes over there above Legend that you were pointing at?
that's getting down.
Wait, yeah.
I don't know what the
Yeah,
name
those
of
are
it is,
oval.
Yeah, they
Is
don't
that-
have names on
They
this.
oval lakes?
Is that Oak Lake? I think it is.
I think it is too.
Oh, we're good.
Cause like Blue Lake is closed, a bunch of them are up in the wilderness, so there's no problem.
Ones if we can, put those on as well.
I think Alta Lake is closed.
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah, that other one, is that up to Twist River, that one over there right next to the red?
This is the
Oh,
twist
over
river
there.
here.
Which one? We have.
That one little spot. Oh,
This one?
no, to your right. Keep going right, keep way over to you, right there. Yeah,
That's, is that
that
Crater?
pretty scatter like,
It might be Scatter or,
yeah,
yeah, one of those.
yeah.
The ones that don't have labels, we'll see if we can get labels on them. We put disclaimers all over them. I mean, this is, you
Yeah.
know, two different files brought together. The DOE's maps are not reconciled parcel boundaries, just what they are. But we can put this on the website in response to public request. I just, since I thought the about commissioners are comfortable with it.
Yeah, I'm comfortable with it.
So we'll put labels on the ones that don't have a label on it. It should go on in today or tomorrow, probably tomorrow. Benson.
I have a question, I'm sorry, in regards to that.
Yes.
Okay, so right now, we know that we're working through mitigation issues, or not issues, but mitigation measures with DOE a little bit, trying to figure out if we can do anything. My thought is that we stop, subdivision, these closed basins for right now, until we know what we can mitigate for. Because, you know, talking to John Kirk, they were talking about, okay, you know, in some of these, you know, put in a well and mitigate through a well because it's easier because you don't have trucks going up in there. Because he said, you know, if you're trying to mitigate for a whole bunch of houses up in there, that's a lot of trips with a truck into a.
You're talking about mitigation
By storage. I won't right now, and understand how much water we have to mitigate for.
Allowing subdivisions to go forth is just putting a big burden on somebody. You're just setting yourselves up for a fight. I agree.
So.
The cleanest vehicle to, thinking about this, the cleanest vehicle to do that would probably be your 17A400.
Groundwater, or
Designate the, what we've come to call the restricted areas of the closed basin. Both as currently adopted or hereinafter amended would be language I would suggest, as water availability study. What we would be studying then, for the most part, is what sorts of mitigations could be employed to allow people to build at any rate, or maybe subdivide. It will be up to you, obviously, in the end, in the future. But what the discussion we had the other day, the Department of Ecology, of course, I've been thinking of it in terms of physically transporting water as opposed to moving water rights around and that sort of thing. And they make a legitimate point. But what they did introduce, I won't say it's new, but it's probably a new concept for some, is that where you have, for instance, a parcel, parts in, parts out of the restricted area, DOE seems comfortable with at least considering the possibility of a well outside the restricted area, even though the water may be used inside. So that transported in relative close proximity.
Yeah,
Back and forth.
again, if there's two separate things going on. Everybody within that reach has a right to use the 2 CFS reservation for single domestic use. However, they're limited because they live next to a area where the water is closed due to adjudication. So if the water's coming from, that is not effective, if the water that you're using to mitigate or, you know, whatever we come up with is not affecting the stream they live in, then they seem to okay with it.
Well, you know, conceptually, if you look at municipal systems, that's what they're doing a lot of the time. They're, you know, they have the wells are over here and the use is over there, and sometimes the use process divides.
Right.
Well, if that's an inclination of commissioners, I would suggest that I create the ordinance doing that, 95, and then route to the planning commission for review.
I think that's appropriate.
Very good. Then in terms of the review schedule, the Department of Ecology, talking to John and Kirk, they're going to go to Benson Creek next, probably April-ish. Then they will move to French Creek. And I suppose we could flip them around, but those are probably the two that would be most useful to review next, because you have the higher levels of at least potential density and some existing lots there. So that's probably a good schedule for them to follow.
Did they say anything after I hung up the phone about creating a shapefile down near the Columbia about where 48 actually was not?
Well, yes, we talked about that. John was going to try to do that. I'm going to have Angie, I mean, we'll just do it to the LiDAR, but
Right.
pull out into that area and just put some checkpoints along the ridge line and whatnot to try to figure out, based on elevation, what we're doing is figuring out if the water's more apt to go this way, away from the river, or that way into the river.
DOE said there's,
Did Gene do that, or no? Did Gene ever do that?
He didn't exactly do that, so I'm gonna have you do it if you have a moment to do that, so.
DOE actually said that there was air. So.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, everything in Watson drops
Right,
off
yeah,
that
it goes the other way.
direction. Is that a map of 48 right there with the does it have boundaries on it?
That's 48, right?
Well, it's
Or at
not-
least enough
it's-
of 48.
Yeah, I don't know where the actual boundary is, but I mean, if you think about it, wherever the ridge line is
Mhm.
on either, wherever the ridge lines are, anything that's fallen off the other direction is not falling into the watershed.
Looks pretty good.
Now, 47's down there,
Say 47
right
there.
around the dam, I know, comes down in,
We'll build you that. And then I'll walk Angie through what I wanted to do with the LiDAR.
I got another question too on that, just because I'm trying to think about all these things about lots,
Sure.
number of lots and things like that. Where are we gonna go with steep I mean, you drive down the lower Methow and there's a lot of steep country in there. It's really, really rocky. You're not gonna put a house on it. So.
Unless you're my phone.
Well, 1 in 42,000 is not super bad, so.
Well, sometimes, I can't remember how the counting works, but I mean, if you set it up so that you're going to a certain slope that you can't build on, there's whatever you have to perch on that actually requires the extra studies. Now, that's the way.
You have to do an engineered.
Seismic.
And so.
They just restrict, like, I went to a workshop down in Sun Valley,
Mhm.
and you come to a certain
Grade.
and it's
Right. Well, and see, that's what I'm wondering. is-
same with all
is-
alluvials, they don't let them build on alluvials.
Well, that's a good idea.
Well, yeah.
Let's not go to that
You
real
know,
good
people
idea,
will.
I mean.
But the steep slopes one is, and I think about this because, some of them, like, go to Grand Coulee and, look up in the heights there and right close to town, and there's some houses perched on bluffs, right? And, they, and there was a tough one to get through because everybody knows everything about the property in the town, the best construction, and they don't wanna, even bother with it. But an engineering report was required to do stability analysis, the geotech stuff. And then, setbacks from that bluff were the other part of it. But, it was, steep slopes is how you're affecting that, the steep slope, the safety issue, does it absorb water, all these things. And just because it's steep doesn't preclude you from perching somewhere, and I don't know if the county did a site analysis on, he must have, on the attorney that put his up on Doe Haven up there, but there's the last place I ever think I'd see a house, but, you go up to it, it's a perfectly safe situation, it's solid rock, it's got relatively good. But when I first looked at it, I went, who in the heck would be crazy enough to build up there like Warren up there in the cliff?
Well, I'm just saying for the overall size of the lower Methow Reach and the 2 CFS reservation are really, they butt up against each other. There's areas down there you're not gonna be able to.
No, yeah, I
You
agree. You
can't
just-
build on them, so I mean, if they get taken out of our you know, if we, to get down to
Do a buildable analysis.
Yeah, to get down a buildable analysis, you gotta know, you know, if we're in R1 down there and 30% of the R1 can't be built on, well, that, okay, so that's a limiting factor, but.
And that's the impact it would have. Actually, the steep slopes are gonna come up, I would project, and in fact have to the point already, under 3 subject. Now, where it'll have impact is when you do your undeveloped lots that could be developed.
Right.
If they're not buildable, then they're not potentially developable lots. It would also impact the potential lot creation. Yeah, a 10-acre parcel,
Yeah.
you can't build on the 1-acre zone where there's 10 lot. That, while mathematically you can create them, you can't do anything with them if you don't. So there's no prohibition against it unless you can't come up with an engineered foundation.
But there's-
So is there a way in LiDAR to take a lot and see if it's solely 30%?
Yeah.
Just
you
distance
do that
between-
analysis. We have,
You
yes,
do
we
it.
have the slope.
Just a contour line analysis.
That's what I was wondering.
But also there's other language, it's like it says it, may be required, so you can look at the permeability of the soil and things like that he was talking about.
So could you in GIS, in the lower Methow reach, tell us how many lots are completely over 30% in grade?
Yeah, I'm sure.
At some point, could you get that information for us?
Well, it'd probably be Gene, but
Or Gene?
We didn't do it by lots, we did it by acres, correct me if I'm wrong.
I don't wanna know by acres.
Well, no, I understand, but my moral of the story, I think the steep slopes are mapped. Or
he
could be
has
mapped.
steep slope data. It's
Right.
not like there's like just a polygon, a big polygon. It's more like he'll have to intersect it again to see
Right,
which ones it hits and then do a count of how many it hits and that's.
Okay. Right.
But generally has,
So there's the
The
ability of
slopes,
it's there, it'll still
yeah.
take an analysis, which would take some time.
Let's explore that for you. So it'll be under the banner of critical areas. Should it be there, would impact public safety, those sorts of considerations. It will likely come up under wildfire mitigation. Because in the Chelan County analysis, it showed those structures built on or immediately on top steep slopes, were more vulnerable because of the behavior of the fire, and it makes sense.
Not to mention the fact you can't physically get a truck around, around the house. I mean, you're fighting half the.
So you have the wildfire mitigation where it will come up. You also have, and although I'm not going to write at this point the IS around it, but you have your, what I'll call view shed protection.
that's the piece that is probably missing in the steep slopes.
Yeah,
sort of
what?
analysis.
Sorry.
View shed.
View shed protection, some couch in terms of dark sky, and that's, I'm not gonna write a section, it's a comment, so I'll respond to it. I'm not gonna write as a significant issue in the EIS, trying to quantify any environmental impact. Not to say it's not, I mean, it's policy level discussion for you, the planning commission, before you to have. So by saying it's not a significant issue, I'm not saying it's not important, maybe worthy of discussion, but I'm not gonna write an EIS around it. But it will come up under that banner as well, already has. So those are the three, related but not.
That's where
Subjects under which building on your steep slopes will come up.
some of the steep slope ordinances in Colorado, places like that, are actually not just looking at the safety factor, but they were looking at the view sheds. And, because remember when Rusty Bonzer was here planning, and he came from Colorado, land values there exceed Methow by far.
Yeah.
And the whole control was always how far they're gonna go up the ridges, and they're way back up or up the whole town there. And that was his focus when he was working as a planning.
That's the same thing, in Jackson. The millionaires that moved in there and moved the original residents out are now mad because the billionaires moving in, moving millions.
when I visited there, at one point, it was the land of the berms, because the developments along the roadways were all, then they were, had standards where they were requiring berms with trees on, so you couldn't see the developments. They were all hidden. That was the thing at the time, anyway, I was running around with the guy that had read the newspaper there, and he was telling us something about that.
Let's see. I think that's all under 48. Voluntary Stewardship Program. The Conservation Commission has announced they have more money available through this fiscal period, so June 30. The Conservation District has said they could spend some more with their implementation program, if they could get it. We did an analysis for what expenses we would incur under the grant administration. The numbers came out to about 24,000 and change. So the Conservation District has submitted a request for that additional funding. If we are successful, I'll come back to you with an amended scope of work for the Conservation District contract. So it's all still reimbursable, money in, money out. Right now, there's enough room in my professional services line to do that, because we haven't started paying out for the RIA 49 contract yet. But on a side note, I will be coming to you once I get their budget, taking on to the next subject. I don't have the rest of, the missing piece for the facilitator contract is the budget. I don't have that. So we have the contract.
Do a budget amendment.
Pardon?
Just a budget amendment.
I will probably come to you at that time, once I have a handle on what's left to spend under the VSP, have a handle on what's left, or what we will spend on the RIA 49, and now, changing scope of that well tracking grant. It's not gonna be staff and all of those, as we worked out before, most of the professional services. So, more of the story will come in.
But those are all budget neutral activities.
It's all budget neutral, but I will need to bump that professional services one. Let's see. We still owe a couple of appointment letters, which I still have to get over to you. The notice for capital facilities going out, that would be the only update I would offer at this point. The last item I do want to go over with you is, I have a contact now, Department of Defense, who actually operates out of the Kitsap County area, who is essentially in charge of outreach and is kind of the complaint department for impacts brought about by military operations. Probably comes as no surprise.
You mean jets flying in the Methow?
That's the exact sort of,
Man.
that's the exact, I went under the envoy the other day up there, I think I told you about that.
Yeah.
Talking to the fellow there on Wolf Creek. It was so low and so fast. It was one of those where you heard the signatures that went by, it was already way over there.
Yeah, and the ones where you can see the pilot's helmet and read every single digit on their plane.
If you look down, yeah.
This is where the missile goes.
It was pretty
Laying on the
exciting.
ground looking up.
You don't even need to be laying on the ground, believe me.
Well,
You see them coming up the
The
valley.
laying on the ground comes from it knocking you over.
Oh, yeah.
It's such a surprise.
And it probably comes as no surprise that there's a certain heightened level of military training activity throughout the nation.
Yeah.
I think it's 50 feet in this MOA though.
Fair enough.
500 feet above ground level, but they can be in the trough of a valley.
No, that's general aviation. I'm talking about the military operations here.
If you could see the face,
Oh, yeah.
They're
Yeah,
too
I deal
low.
with it all the time.
1980.
You fly through that, going to Spokane, and those guys target private civilian aircraft. They come after you. They practice on you.
Are you
So-
gonna find out what the answer to this question in your endeavor here?
Well, where this is all going is they've actually sent me several maps identifying certain areas of operation, things like that, which I will send to the commissioners for your information. She's also, given me some contact information, if people do wish to call and ask what's going on, or offer a complaint or whatever. She also wants to schedule it, come in and talk with the board about what's going on.
If there's some general protocols that we're talking about that they have to provide.
Gave me late last Friday, and she's working on her schedule. And when I get some idea when she might be up there, I'll work with the clerk of the board to set up a meeting with you all.
Yeah, but, you know, the big farm over there, over shuttles. When you come to the top of the hill, where you look down and see where,
Yeah.
everything's, as far as you can see, practically, for his boy, Roger. Oh, back in 86 or 87, died in a plane crash on the ranch, or that they were hit by a military aircraft.
Well, you know, that's interesting, because that one, I was just thinking about that when these guys are flying, and don't get me wrong, I mean, actually, it doesn't happen all that often. You know, what kind of protocols do they have when they're flying down the valley at 500 feet or whatever, and you got a bunch of, you know, I mean, you got quite a contingency of, you know, just, general aviation pilots that are, you know, flying around.
Well, they know where you are, they got the technology. And now there's a new deal coming up. By January 20, there's a ADS-B that every craft has. And that puts you on the radar to all the towers, in fact, plus two guys got in and out. He spent a bunch of money because he's got a real expensive glass down. He knows where every single airplane around him is, what the end number is, it's all
Put on there.
They have that now for commercial, don't they?
oh yeah, but it's coming to civilian aircraft. You will not be able to fly into like Spokane. I mean, if you were in a Piper Cub and wanted to stay with that valley, you don't have to have it. You can move anywhere, and you can't go above 10,000 feet.
Interesting discussion.
Well, Commissioners, that's your agenda for today. Anything for me?
I have a question. In the day I was trying to get over my pneumonia, you mentioned about the Wenatchee Okanogan travel plan.
I did.
Are they through scoping or the end of public comment?
I have no idea. What I was referencing was, a person that I know asked me, hey, where can I ride my ATV or my WATV on the Forest Service property?
Anywhere you want.
Wow. So I said, I'm not a lawyer, I know what I've seen in travel management. Anyway, moral of the story, I go over to the guy's house, and he's like, well, he goes, the travel management plan says that as long as I'm licensed, and I go, yeah, but it says all highway, and he said, no, it doesn't say all, it says public roads or highways. And I said, will you go get that for me? And he brought it in, and sure enough, the travel management plan that they handed him said, if your wheeled all-terrain vehicle can be licensed for roads or highways, not in, then it can be on any Forest Service road. He said, okay, well, it says that, but then they handed him a map and said, no, that's not really what it means.
Well, that's the game that the Forest
I know
Service
that,
has
I understand that, but then they hand him a map and said, you can only drive here. I'm like, well, but this is what the travel management plan says. It says public roads or highways. Those can be licensed for public roads, 25 miles an hour or under. It doesn't say and, it says or. So
if they're open for public comment, and I brought this up with Clay Ellen, those guys had tunnel vision that the Forest Service did, and the people working on the travel management plan, because there's a big contingency, even a lot of people came from the coast to that meeting. And they said, in the new travel management plan, the reason that you can't open the roads to WATVs is we would have to have an engineer go look at all of these roads. And I said, I said, all 4-digit and 3-digit Forest Service roads were designed exactly to county specs. I worked on an engineering crew in the off-season when I spoke there. The Forest Service had engineering crews, and you went out there and you staked those roads, and when they were built to county specs. So why isn't there a categorical exemption for 3-digit and 4-digit Forest Service roads? It would be easy. It's already been engineered. It's
So-
gone through the process when it was built.
Did you say that it was out for comment?
That's why I want to know, because that's the comment I want to put
We
into
need
those
to,
guys.
we do need to figure
We
out.
can double check and see, you recall the last time we asked and kind of been shoved again.
Because they want to shove that off into a corner. They don't want to recognize that.
Well, and if.
Because they're looking for an
We'll
excuse.
try to determine again the status of that.
One other thing. Brad Thompson, US Fish and Wildlife Service, called me the other day. Said that, they are looking at delisting.
He sent an email.
Yeah, so we have. his
I
email.
forwarded
We
it to you.
We need
We need to comment on
to
it.
make a comment on the federal delisting of wolves. And obviously, we all need to put our heads together and figure out what kind of a comment it needs to say, but I think for a county that's split into a federal zone and a not federal zone, that delisting of the federal portion of it would make it a lot easier to know who's managing it. what's-
Drafts of comments we submitted in past on the RV. Then the commissioner.
Yeah.
anything like that?
It's in the paper.
Oh, yeah.
And actually, the article that I picked up, it was surprisingly, fairly fair article. It was in the Chronicle, and the Wenatchee World with the same article over the weekend. So,
Anything else for me, Commissioner?
One other thing, before we go, were you able to talk with Peggy Porter from?
not yet.
Okay, that's
Given we were in session.
right. So that is, important, 'cause- so
It's on
Jamie's place, which is a, assisted living home over in the Methow Valley. In looking at their financial, the way that they do business, their business model, the 50% reimbursement from Medicare has come up as being a very limiting factor to the demographic that they can serve.
Did you see that, when Walker sent an email also?
Yep.
Those two.
Yep, and so, but now this is not just about, ambulance service, this is about actually
Understand, but I think-
everything now. I do
It's
too, that's
about-
why I
I
said.
think it's about hospitals too, so.
Sure.
I mean,
Yeah, absolutely.
It's been an issue for some time, and I did some, actually Potts and I did some fishing around on the issue, because they had a bill, last year or the year before, proposed that the rate, change. Didn't go through, and we went to, because one of the sponsors, the private sponsor was Braun, and we went to visit with him, and of course, even his position, he was very, very busy with it, and I wanted to pick his brain on why it didn't happen. Well, this is why I was telling you that, Tim, Olmsted, something like that, anyway, he's from Spokane, and I caught him in the afternoon, asked him, and he had this explanation. We'll follow up on it. This week, we have a meeting, in Wenatchee with the, ACH. Dan's part of that, finally got a full group to meet, and, we'll see what that means, because he said it had, a very direct connection with the NCOs.
Really?
And I was going, and he goes, it's unfortunately, it doesn't equate to how the NCOs work in the picture, and I was going, I only had a brief encounter with him because they grabbed him as he was going by, and Ormsby.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and, I believe he is, Senate, maybe appropriations or something like that. He held up some bills, as a result, and, I was watching him on TV the other night, and I could see that they were passing everything money attached.
Yeah, no fiscal, no.
And so, but it sounds a bit complicated, we just need to learn what the mechanisms are.
Could you at least try to contact her this evening and give her the names of those?
I will.
Set.
I just haven't had time today.
Yeah, no, I understand. I just wanna make sure because she's gonna be tomorrow,
Yeah,
and if she.
but I wanna just stress that it's across the board.
No, and I told her that, I said, look, I said, it's hard, it would be hard for us to go out and specifically write a letter in support of Jamie's place getting
Right.
funding when we know that we have the, the ambulance service and everybody,
The hospitals.
the hospitals and everything, but I would be willing to absolutely write a letter stating that because of Okanogan County's demographics, how poor we are, and that we are going to lose companies and businesses that provide medical services because they cannot pay the minimum wage requirements and the insurance requirements and all those things, but only being reimbursed 50% for Medicare. So we're gonna lose, jobs, and lose health, facilities and services,
So.
Yep.
It's on top of the list of healthcare items.
Yeah. Big deal if we can get it all together.
Well, and it's really, it is a big effect on rural counties that have to have subsidized.
Nationwide rural counties.
Yeah, nationwide, they'd have to have subsidized, districts that are subsidizing the rates, with low call volumes and very rural areas, It's a problem.
Yeah.
We wouldn't be probably going through the grief that we're going through with the Orgo EMS levy and raising it if it weren't better rate
Agreed? Yeah.
reimbursements.
It'd be more rates support.
Pardon?
It'd be more rates
It
support.
would.
Mhm.
The problem, as you know, they reimburse a certain percentage on the assumption that the patient pays the rest. But that assumes the patient can.
Well, same thing, Eric Fritz was in here today, talking about VA versus Medicare.
Right.
And VA pays slower, so the hospital bills VA and Medicaid at the same time. Medicaid pays, and then VA goes, we're not gonna pay. But it's a legitimate Medicare or VA, so he's been working with the hospitals, telling them, bill this one and then bill this one, so that, because if they find out, if the VA finds out, oh yeah, it was our responsibility, then they have to go back and the hospital has to send the Medicaid money back, and then they gotta try and collect the VA money within a 90-day window.
So in the end, in the final analysis, you have two insurance programs. Why shouldn't?
But Eric came up
why
with, that's a
shouldn't
good
both
solution that
patients
he came up with,
support?
and he went to North Valley Hospital and explained it to him. Except what do you say about a 5-minute conversation with the COO?
Well, I'm not acknowledging that the minimum wage goes up and then they don't make an adjustment to the reimbursements, it's like missing something.
And you, Sally, you might talk to Eric. You know who he is?
To Aaron?
Eric,
Oh, Eric, yeah.
the VSO at Tonasket.
Yeah, I'll give her a call. You guys could talk.
I'm done talking.
Me too.
Anything else for me, Commissioners, on that note?
Thank you for being here.
Thanks.